Dead America, Lowcountry Part 17. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 28. 2 hours before dawn. Even though it was the middle of the night, not a single soul was asleep. Activity at the school was intense, with everyone moving with purpose, preparing for the day ahead. Tyrell paced the halls, surveying the situation, occasionally barking out orders to the others as they fortified the windows and packed goods to be moved to the vehicles in case of a hasty retreat. He walked to a classroom towards the end of the hall near the cafeteria where they had the majority of their weapons. Inside he found Dante, Coleman, Tate, and Ace. "Gentlemen," he greeted, "how are we looking?" "Managed to scrape together 3 mags each for 3 of our assault rifles," Coleman replied. "And a couple mags of handgun ammo for Dante here." The man in question shook his head. "Doesn't leave much for anybody else, however," he said dryly. "If we don't get past this first hurdle, it won't matter if anybody else is packing," Tyrell pointed out. Dante took a deep breath. "Fair enough," he admitted. Ace clapped him on the shoulder. "Don't worry, buddy," he drawled. "I have a few things planned for our defense here." He held up a gigantic bundle of sparklers, easily 1,000, but nobody had the time to count. Tyrell nodded, a smirk growing on his face. "A little redneck ingenuity, huh?" he asked. "Oh, yes, sir," Ace replied with a grin. "When you ain't got much, you learn to get creative to achieve your desired level of destruction." "It's cool," Coleman said thoughtfully, "but not exactly something we can throw at them." "That's true," Ace agreed. "But if they try and break in, they're gonna have a hell of a surprise." Tyrell inclined his head. "You got materials to make any more of those?" he asked. "I can get you 3 of them about this size," Ace replied with a nod. "Ain't gonna cover all the doors and windows, but should be good in a pinch." "Well, if you have any other bright ideas, you don't hesitate to make it happen," Tyrell said, pointing a finger at him. The redneck grinned, giving him a thumbs up. "I'll see what kinds of tricks I can pull out of my sleeve," he promised. "Get Maddox and Lily to help you if you need it," the captain instructed. "Pretty sure they're getting ready to hit the neighborhood," Ace said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "Getting as much gas as we can." Dante raised his eyebrow. "Think it's wise to send those 2 out together?" he asked. "And in the middle of the night, too?" "Maddox is a man possessed," Ace said, raising his palms. "I feel sorry for anyone or anything that comes within 50 yards of them." Dante pursed his lips. "Hope you're right," he muttered. "Don't worry, Scarface. I am right," Ace assured him. "I care about Lil too, and I wouldn't let her do anything too dangerous." Dante tongued his cheek and gave the redneck a knowing look. Okay, Ace drawled, raising his hands in defense. "I know I can't make that girl do a damn thing, but if it was overly dangerous, I would tell you." Dante chuckled. "That sounds a little more realistic," he said. "How are our vehicles looking?" Tate piped up. "I just checked them before coming in," Ace replied. "We got 2 SUVs gassed up and ready to go, only bare essentials in there. Some food and water and some medical supplies. Sounds like you all are going to have a full load coming back with you, so I wanted to make sure there was plenty of room." "If you can spare a few weapons, bats, pipes, whatever, toss them in there," Tyrell instructed. "We might have to hoof it at some point, and the more armed people we have, the better." "I'll take care of it now," Ace replied. "You boys need anything else, just give me a shout." He gave them a wave and left, leaving the 4 members of the strike team. "So, Tate, you sure you're good with this particular mission?" Tyrell asked. The redneck shrugged. "The whole thing seems like a suicide run to me, so does it really matter where I'm stationed?" he drawled. "Nothing like some early morning optimism to get you going," Coleman muttered. Tate sighed. "Let's be real, man," he insisted. "You 2 and your buddy on the roof are badasses. No debate there. Dante here isn't quite at your level, but he can hang. The rest of us, we're fucking civilians, man." The fact we've lasted this long against zombies and highly trained, heavily armed men is nothing short of a miracle. And now we're challenging them directly. If a bookie was putting odds on us walking away from this, someone could make a fortune putting $10 down on us. So yeah, I'm good being the ambush guy in the store. If you have these kinds of doubts, then why are you still here and not with the others at the safe house? Coleman asked, raising an eyebrow. Because these assholes are in my neighborhood, fucking up my shit, and making everybody's lives miserable, he said, jabbing a thumb into his own chest. I didn't think I'd last this long in a zombie apocalypse, so might as well take out some of those bastards while playing with house money. Plus, the alternative was to go to the safe house with those 2 little kids running around. Angry guys with guns aimed at me seems the better of the 2 options. Coleman chuckled, shaking his head. Not a fan of kids, huh? He asked. Needy, annoying, and constantly screaming at the top of their lungs, Tate said, counting the reasons off on his fingers. I'll pass. Well, as long as you're on board, Terrell cut in. We're not going to have transport for you, so you're going to have to hike it back after you spring the trap. Tate nodded. It's all good, he assured him. I know the area like the back of my hand. If they are stupid enough to follow me, I shouldn't have any trouble losing them. Just don't leave the school without me. Terrell nodded. If we're forced out, we'll be sure to leave you a vehicle, he promised. I can live with that, Tate replied. The captain looked around. Anybody else got anything? He asked, and the trio exchanged looks before everyone shook their heads, shrugging. Load up, then, Terrell instructed. We leave in 5. Chapter 2 90 minutes before dawn. No Name got his gear ready in a room near the waterfront, only a quarter-mile from the prison ship. He checked his assault rifle before placing it into a canvas bag and grabbing another to repeat the process. He checked every magazine he had and checked them for ammo, stuffing them into the bag as well. Despite the fact it was well before dawn, he knew there was a chance someone could spot him with all the firepower, hence the bag. He stared at the arsenal for a moment before walking over to his closet. He pulled out a large metal box from the bottom, opening it to reveal several handguns. Could have really used some grenades and high explosives, he muttered to himself, shaking his head. A few handguns weren't going to make a lot of difference if they had to go up against the full force of QXR. But he emptied the box of guns and ammo into the bag anyway. At least we won't be going down without a fight. He closed up the bag and slung it over his shoulder, the weight of which caused his muscular upper body to shift ever so slightly. He took a moment, looking around his residence. As soon as he walked out the door, he'd be giving this all up. Safety, security, living in the lap of luxury while being at the top of the food chain. Life had never been that good for him. There was always some run-down hellhole he had to stay at on a mission, or a cheap extended stay hotel while visiting a base for training. Of course, that had been when shelter was available, something that was hard to find on some of the missions he'd been on. No Name took a deep breath, shaking his head. He knew it was the right thing to give all of this up. He couldn't live in such luxury if it came at the expense of innocent lives and well-being. All right, let's get this party started, he said, and headed out of his little villa, securing the door behind him. He chuckled to himself, realizing there was no point in locking it since he wouldn't be back. But habit was habit. He headed up the walkway by the shore, the moonlight shining brightly off of the gently lapping water. He savored every step. The last few he would have without worrying about the violence coming his way. At the edge of the walk, he looked out across a large parking lot towards the docks. There were a few boats there, including the prison ship, which stood prominently in the first bay. No Name did a scan of the area looking for anything suspicious. He hoped that he wasn't being watched, since it would mean the operation was blown before it even began. But he prepared himself for the worst. He reached down and unlatched the holster for his handgun, just to be safe. When he didn't spot anything out of the ordinary, he started walking towards the boat, moving briskly but not overly aggressive so he wasn't out of place. Across the lot, about 50 yards away, a mercenary named Michaels sat inside of a darkened room in what had once been a restaurant. The window was cracked ever so slightly, just enough for him to be able to have a sniper rifle scope sitting on the sill. He tracked No Name as he walked towards the boat. "Mosley, it's Michaels," the man said into his walkie-talkie. "You copy?" "What you got for me?" Mosley crackled through immediately. "I got one big bold bastard who is out for an early morning stroll," Michaels drawled. The cluck of a tongue came through the speaker clearly. "Does he look ready for war?" his superior asked. "His loadout looks pretty standard," Michaels admitted. "However, he does have one big-ass duffel bag slung over his shoulder." "If I know him," Mosley said thoughtfully, "there's enough weapons in that bag to invade a small country." Michaels stiffened. "Should I intercept him?" he asked. "That anxious to die, are you?" came the amused response. Michaels swallowed hard and squared his shoulders. "No, sir," he replied firmly. "Just ready to do what needs to be done." "You keep that enthusiasm, because it will carry you far in this company," Mosley said. "And as luck would have it, we're about to have a job opening." Michaels pursed his lips. "So, are you sure you don't want me to intercept?" he asked. "No, we need to see who his co-conspirators are," Mosley explained. "We have one chance to root out the traitors, so we're going to have to be patient. I have the boat patrols on high alert, so if they are going by boat, they aren't going to get very far." "I have eyes on the harbor, so if they make a move, I'll be in touch," Michaels promised. "Good man," Mosley replied. "Good man." The line clicked off, and he focused back on No Name as he got onto the boat. He stared at the hulking mercenary's bald head through his scope as he approached a door. But Michaels couldn't see inside. "Who are you talking to, traitor?" he murmured to himself. No Name stood at the door, holding up a hand to keep Kemp from stepping out onto the dock. "We being watched, Commander?" his friend asked, raising an eyebrow. "Didn't see anybody," No Name replied quietly. "But I just got that feeling. Better to be safe than sorry." "Better come on in, then," Kemp said, waving him in. No Name entered, keeping his friend out of sight. He secured the door tightly behind him, making sure nobody could get in. "What do we have here?" he asked as he turned around. Kemp jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "Got 2 men sleeping on the second deck," he said. "Got a rig ready to go to lock them inside." "And on the targets?" No Name asked. Kemp held up a finger. "One man," he replied. "Do you know him?" the bold mercenary asked, cocking his head. Kemp shrugged. "New guy, don't even know his name," he replied. "Came in mid-shift last night and took over." "That's not a good sign," No Name muttered. His partner took a deep breath. "Thinking we're burned?" he asked. "If we are or not, doesn't really change our situation," No Name said, shaking his head. "We're past the point of no return." Kemp grinned. "Good thing I don't have second thoughts, then," he said brightly. "How are we doing on time?" No Name asked. His partner checked his watch. "Captain Nico said he'll be ready to go in 15, he said. "He doesn't seem like the type who would appreciate being kept waiting." "Okay, you go secure the sleepers," No Name instructed. "I'll take care of the new guy." They shared a nod and headed for the stairwell in the center of the boat. Kemp broke away at the first landing, heading down to barricade the sleepers' quarters door. No Name continued to the bottom of the boat, walking over towards the prison cell area. The hallway was fairly narrow, just wide enough for No Name to squeeze through with the large canvas bag on his shoulder. As he approached, he spotted a large man sitting at a table, looking over the monitors. As the echoes of his footsteps preceded him, the guard perked up and turned to look at him, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, sir, but that's as far as you go," he said. No Name gave him a casual grin, keeping his voice a steady drawl. "You're new here," he said, "so I'm going to assume you are unaware of who I am." "The commander without a name," the guard replied with a knowing gaze. "Yes, sir, I'm quite familiar with you. In fact, my orders aren't the generic nobody enters variety. Rather, they are specifically tailored to you. Shit, we're burned, No Name thought, but betrayed no fear on his face, nodding silently as he contemplated his next words. Now I realize we just met, and my words may not matter a whole lot to you, the guard drawled, leaning back in his chair casually. But I do have some friendly advice for you. No Name sighed. Oh, this should be good, he said. Just walk away, the guard said, spreading his palms. Theo is an understanding man, and you haven't done anything that can't be worked out in one way or another. No Name chuckled. Well, I appreciate the advice, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to press on, he said with a shrug. Not something I would recommend, Commander, the guard replied, almost in a sing-song voice. No Name stiffened. Since you were so generous in giving out unsolicited advice, allow me to do the same, he said dryly. You should forget your orders and forget I was here. There's a room just a few yards from you. Simply go inside, I'll lock it up tight, and you won't be in any trouble. He tilted his head back and forth. Now, you might not get any cushy gigs like this for a while, but it's better than the alternative. Which is? The guard asked. No Name straightened his shoulders. I go through you, he said firmly. The guard stood up, revealing his 6-foot-tall height just a shade taller than No Name himself, and a bit bulkier. That's one thing I can guarantee won't happen, sir, he said. No Name sighed and dropped the canvas bag to the ground, positioning it vertically along the wall to give himself as much room as possible in the hallway. The guard gave him time to do this, and No Name appreciated him showing him respect despite them being adversaries. He readied himself for a fight, not wanting to fire his handgun for fear of the sound traveling. They may be burned, but it wasn't an inferno yet. The guard rushed him, throwing several strikes that No Name deflected. He punched back, but his blows were mostly blocked save for one sneaky one he delivered to the gut, causing the guard to take a couple of steps back. Both men gathered themselves. You got a little fight in you, the guard huffed. No Name cocked a brow. I haven't even broken a sweat yet, he said. The guard smirked and moved back in. He swung hard, but the bold mercenary ducked under it. He brought his arms straight down, hitting No Name in the shoulders, but he was braced for the impact. He lunged forward, burying his shoulder into the guard's gut and driving him back. No Name lifted him up, just enough off of the ground to get the guard off balance. His weight, combined with No Name's pushing, sent the two of them careening back down the hallway, with the guard flailing around trying to grab onto the wall as No Name drove him back. They slammed into the door leading to the prison, crashing right through it. Once through, No Name lifted up on the legs again, driving the guard into the ground. The commotion startled the prisoners awake. What in the holy hell is going on? Troy cried. I'm gonna gut you like the catch of the day, the guard snarled. God damn, what did I do? Troy snapped. You're welcome to try, No Name replied in a low tone, and Grace leapt from her bed. She smacked the small light next to her to see what was going on, and her eyes widened at the sight of their bold friend fighting a hulking mercenary a little bigger than him. No Name punched the guard and received one in return, both blows landing in the face. They staggered each other, but both quickly regained their composure. Everybody up now! Grace bellowed, and everyone leapt from their beds, honing in on the action that could be the difference between their escape and death. Hawk made eye contact with No Name as he deflected a punch from the guard, and the bold mercenary gave him a quick nod. A few more blows were exchanged before No Name took a step back, and his opponent cocked his head in confusion. Little late to be running now, he said. Funny, No Name replied, lowering his shoulder. I was going to say the same thing to you. He sprinted forward, driving the guard against Hawk's cage. The guard brought his elbow down onto No Name's back, but Hawk reached through the bars and got him into a sleeper hold. Night-night, sweetheart, he purred. The guard flailed about, reaching up to try to grab Hawk's arm, but the prisoner's hold was solid. He reached for his knife next, but No Name clamped down on his arms, preventing him from doing so. The guard let out some choked gasps of air, but eventually went limp, slumping to the ground. Thanks for the assist, No Name said. Hawk playfully brushed off his shoulder. Any time, he said. The bold mercenary immediately took a knee, digging through the guard's pockets, and pulling out the keys. He unlocked Hawk's cage first, motioning to the sleeping man. "Get him inside there and lock it up," he instructed. Hawk nodded and grabbed the guard by the armpits to drag him inside as No Name moved on to the next cage. "What's going on, man?" Eddie asked. "Jailbreak," No Name said simply. Eddie's eyes widened. "Hell yeah!" he declared. Once the group was all released, they met in the center of the room and then froze at the sound of footsteps. No Name crept towards the door, relief washing over him when he spotted Kemp coming down the stairs. "Door is secured," he reported. "Good. We have to move," No Name replied. Kemp checked him out, eyes lingering on the bit of blood on his face, and then looked past him to the locked-up sleeping guard. "I see we're off to a stellar start," he said dryly. "It gets better," No Name replied, holding up a finger. "We're 100% burned." "Fuck," Kemp said brightly. Austin raised his hand. "What does that mean?" he asked shakily. "It means we're not the only ones who know about this jailbreak," Grace supplied, and he swallowed hard. "So, what's the plan?" Troy asked, crossing his arms. "We have a boat waiting to take us to the mainland, where we're meeting up with Grace's brother Dante," No Name explained, and her heart leapt into her throat at the mention of her brother. "From there, it's up to them." Hawk nodded. "Can't be any worse than where we are now," he drawled. "Ain't that the truth?" Eddie added. "How are we getting to the boat?" Grace asked. No Name waved to them. "Follow me," he said, and led them down the hallway towards the middle of the ship. He flipped open a small hatch, revealing a handle that would open up the side of the hull. It swung open, revealing a small hole big enough for a person to go through and dive directly into the water. It was still night out, but the moonlight was bright. No Name poked his head out, looking around for signs of trouble, but found nothing. "They must think we're going out on top," he thought. "We might still have a chance." He stepped back inside, turning to the others. "Okay, I don't see any resistance," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean it's not there. We get into the water quietly and we stay plastered to the side of the boat. I'm going to lead us around to Nico's boat, which is 2 bays down from where we are." "How the hell we getting in?" Troy asked. "He's got a hatch on the front, but we're going to have to come up from underneath the water," No Name explained. "So be ready for that. Everybody clear?" Everyone nodded all around. "Kemp, I want you bringing up the rear," the bold mercenary continued, pointing to his most trusted partner. "Keep an eye on everyone, and if there's trouble—" "I'll make sure they wish they never started it," Kemp cut in, holding up a victorious fist. No Name nodded and turned back to the hatch. He secured the duffel bag full of weapons on his shoulder and lowered himself into the water. He moved away, giving the others room to get in. His shoulders were wired with tension as the group evacuated from the boat, his gaze constantly scanning the shore for trouble. He was surprised that nothing popped up, but it didn't give him any comfort. It felt like the calm before the storm. Finally, Kemp made it into the water, and No Name nodded, leading them around. He pushed along the boat hull to move, kicking his legs to keep his head above water, and paused when he reached the back of the boat, looking around for people and finding nothing. He led them across the first gap between boats, swimming as softly as he could to avoid disturbing the water or splashing too much. They managed to make it all the way across with no confrontation, and he held them up at the next gap. The SS Live in the Dream was in the next bay, but he turned to Grace, keeping his voice low. "I want you all to hold right here," he said. "I'm going to make sure that hatch is open. I'll come back when we're good." She nodded and turned to relay the message as No Name took a few deep breaths and submerged himself. He glided below the surface of the water, carrying the heavy bag of guns and ammo with him. It took a few moments, but finally he was underneath the boat. He aligned himself with the hatch, giving a solid knock on it. He could hear voices muffled through water and structure, and a moment later the hatch opened and broke through, sputtering. "Welcome aboard, my friend," Nico declared with a grin as Kenny helped No Name up. The bold mercenary immediately slammed the bag of weapons down onto the ground. "I appreciate the gesture," Nico said, raising an eyebrow, "but it is not necessary for you to bring a welcome gift." "I figured if we get into a fight," No Name huffed, "we're going to need weapons." The captain blinked at him, looking almost insulted. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, wagging his finger. "I am Captain Nico, and I have provided more weapons to your company than any other. When we have time, I will show you what that means." "No offense was intended, Captain," No Name replied, holding up a palm. "Just like to be prepared." "As do I, my friend, which you will see," Nico said with a big smile. "Now, please, get the others. We must go." No Name took a deep breath and plunged back into the water, swimming back to the group. He popped his head up a few yards from Grace, waving for her and the others to follow. One by one they submerged, moving quickly towards the hatch on the boat. Kenny and No Name pulled them out, one after the other, into the safety of the boat. It was a smaller vessel with cramped quarters, but everyone was excited to be aboard it, considering their previous living arrangements. Once Kemp cleared the hatch, Nico closed it up and secured it. "I know that this is not the most comfortable setting, but please, remain down here and out of sight until we reach land," he instructed. "If we encounter a patrol boat, I will handle it." "The show is yours, Captain," No Name promised. "If you need backup, you know where to find us." When Nico reached the controls, their soaking wet cargo safely tucked away, he flipped the engine on. It hummed for a few moments as he and Kenny looked out over the water towards the island, the mainland looming past them. Even with the bright moonlight, they didn't see any patrol ships. "Think we'll make it across?" Kenny asked quietly. Nico nodded. "Oh, of that I have no doubt," he replied. Kenny wrinkled his nose. "Think we'll make it across without any trouble?" he amended. Nico smirked. "If we do, then what is the fun in that?" he asked. "Once this is over, I'm going to make it my mission in life to find you a hobby," Kenny muttered. The captain put the boat in gear and they got moving, slowly pulling away from the docking bay. Once clear and a little ways away from shore, he opened it up, getting the boat moving at a good clip. About half a mile away from the harbour, they headed towards the tip of a nearby island to get around it to the mainland. A bright spotlight hit them, the sounds of engines roaring in the night. "Well, here's your good time, Captain," Kenny muttered. Nico didn't turn away from the light. "If things go bad, you get down," he said firmly. Kenny swallowed hard, but the captain grinned brightly at the approaching boat. "Sir, please turn around and head back to shore immediately," a mercenary bellowed over a loudspeaker. "It's okay. I'm Captain Nico," the captain declared, waving as if he were greeting an old friend at the beach. "Sir, please turn around and head to—" "I heard you the first time, my friend," Nico cut in loudly. "But I am Captain Nico, and I go where I please. Now, stop talking through that thing. It is giving me a headache." A moment later, 3 mercenaries emerged onto the deck of the guard boat. One of them approached a 50 cal machine gun on the deck, while the other 2 men held assault rifles. "What is this nonsense?" Nico snapped, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "My friend and I are heading out to see a beautiful sunrise, and you threaten me with violence? How dare you?" The lead mercenary waved at his friend, who stopped short of the machine gun, but stayed near it. "Sir, I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm going to need you to—" "Do you know who I am?" Nico interrupted. The mercenary sighed. "No, sir, I do not," he admitted. "I am Captain Nico, close personal friend of Theo Atkinson," he declared, straightening his shoulders. "He assured me that I have free rein during my stay here, and that's exactly what I intend to have." The mercenary raised a palm in surrender. "Again, sir, I apologize," he said. "Do not apologize. Just let me be on my way," Nico insisted. "I'm afraid I can't do that, sir," the mercenary repeated. "And why is that?" the captain asked, rolling his eyes. "What part of free rein do you not understand? Do you wish for me to bring this up with your boss? How do you think he's going to react to someone harassing the only person left in the world who can get him military-grade weaponry?" The lead mercenary glanced at his buddies, leaning over to converse quietly with one. After a few moments, he turned back to the boat. "Okay, sir." "Captain," Nico demanded. The mercenary held up his hand again. "Captain," he corrected. "I can let you and your friend go and enjoy the sunrise. However, I have to check your cargo hold first." Absolutely not, Nico snapped, shaking his head. You're not setting foot on my ship. The mercenary sighed. Then we have a problem, he said. No, you have a problem, Nico replied, reaching under the steering column. I have a solution. He produced a giant machine gun and hip-fired towards them immediately, sending a barrage of hot lead their way. The bullets tore into the lead mercenary, shredding his torso. The man furthest away caught a bullet in the shoulder, sending him to the ground. But he did manage to raise his assault rifle and begin firing. The mercenary closest to the 50 cal quickly got behind it, flipping on the safety and reaching for the trigger. Just as he began to pull it, Nico peppered him with bullets. He slumped over the gun and it swung towards the cargo hold, firing wildly through the hull of the ship. The stream of bullets moved around as the body fell, and Nico fired into the slumped man enough times to push him away from the massive gun. The wounded mercenary staggered away into the control area, and Nico clearly caught him raising a radio to his lips before he disappeared inside. "Kenny, get us out of here," Nico said, and his friend didn't hesitate, getting behind the console. The captain opened up a small drawer, pulling out a block of plastic explosives with a timer on it. He set it to 20 seconds before clicking it and tossing it onto the other boat. "You should move faster," he said dryly. Kenny hit the gas, and the boat sped through the water. Nico aimed for the door as the mercenary appeared from the control area in an attempt to dive for the explosive. The captain fired several times, not hitting him but forcing him back behind cover. When they were just outside of firing range, the mercenary darted out onto the deck and nearly made it to the explosive, before it detonated. A giant fireball illuminated the night sky, the shockwave rattling the boat. A moment later, No Name emerged from the deck below. "Guessing you couldn't talk your way out of it?" he asked. Nico smacked his machine gun. "My baby did all the talking for me," he declared. "I can see that," No Name replied dryly. "Is everyone okay below?" the captain asked. No Name shook his head. "One dead, one injured," he said. "But more pressing is the fact that we're taking on a lot of water. We only have a few minutes before we're sunk. Can you get us to the mainland?" The engine sputtered, and they began to lose speed. "I don't think so," Kenny cut in. "Then get us to that island," No Name instructed, pointing. "We'll get another boat from there." Kenny nodded and floored it, hoping that the little vessel had just enough juice to get them to shore. Chapter 3. 1 hour before dawn. As the boat sped towards shore, the survivors in the cargo hold struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Water poured inside several inches deep and growing. Troy let out a frustrated scream as Grace tied a makeshift bandage around the massive wound in his arm. "Son of a bitch, that hurts," he hissed. She finished knotting the chunk of wet t-shirt she'd torn from her sleeve. "Suck it up, big guy," she murmured. "The day's just getting started." He stared down at the bandage, the cream-colored cloth quickly turning red with blood. Grace grabbed his other hand and put it over the wound. "Keep pressing until it stops bleeding," she instructed. He nodded, swallowing hard and wincing in pain as he put pressure on the fresh hole in his arm. Grace took a deep breath and turned around, clenching her jaw at the others, still staring at what was left of their friend. It had happened so quickly. Bullets tore through the hull of the ship and right through Jackie, nearly cutting her in half. Her face disappeared in a spray of blood and bone, leaving nothing but a gooey mess behind. Austin was on his knees where he'd fallen as soon as it had happened, tears in his eyes as he stared down at her form, gently bobbing in the water. "Jesus," Grace murmured, standing with the rest of the group a few yards away from the grisly scene. "Yeah, those 50 cal rounds don't mess around," Kemp replied softly. "At least she didn't go out in pain," Eddie added, jaw tight. "Probably never knew what hit her," Hawk said and snapped his fingers. "Just lights out." "Jesus Christ," Austin cried, glaring at them both. "Show some goddamn respect for the dead." Hawk and Eddie lowered their gazes, nodding apologetically and keeping quiet to let the young men grieve. It was short-lived, however, as Nico thundered down into the cargo hold. He paused briefly as he took in the scene. "I am sorry for your loss," he said loudly, "but unless you want to end up like your friend, we must prepare." He splashed down into the water, quickly moving to the far side of the boat. He approached a large metal box on the floor, whistling at Hawk and waving him over to help. "Lift onto the table," he instructed. The two of them raised the heavy crate up onto the table, slamming it down. Nico flipped up a panel revealing a keypad and punched in a 6-digit number. The latches opened with a click, and he threw open the box to reveal an assortment of machine guns and ammunition. "Everybody take a weapon," he called. "We're going to need them." Grace, Hawk, and Eddie complied, grabbing a gun and a few extra magazines. Troy approached the box, inclining his head towards it, and Grace draped an assault rifle over his shoulder with the strap. Austin, however, didn't move from his spot. Nico took a deep breath and approached the young man, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Your friend would not want you to die here because of her," he said. "If we are going to survive, we need your help. Honor her by fighting." Austin swallowed hard, but nodded in agreement, and got to his feet shakily. He plucked a machine gun from the box just as Kenny stuck his head down from the upper deck. "Everybody brace for impact," he called. "We're coming in hot." Everyone grabbed the sides of the boat, and a few moments later the whole vessel shook violently as they ran aground. Water immediately stopped pouring in through the hull, sand fluttering in through some of the bigger holes. "Let's move!" Kenny bellowed as the boat stopped moving, and the group filed out of the cargo hold, Nico in the lead. No Name jumped down from the boat deck onto the beach, his bag of weapons slung over his shoulder. As the others prepared to do the same, he surveyed the situation. The moonlight made it easy to see a couple 100 yards into the distance, showing dozens of zombies headed their way from all directions. The closest creature was about 50 yards away and closing. As he scanned, the roar of boat engines in the distance echoed, and he turned to see a trio of patrol boats illuminating the water about half a mile away. "Shit," he muttered. "Let's get a move on, people," he yelled to the group. "There's about to be a big beach party." Almost everyone was on the ground. Hawk helped Troy down, leaving only Nico on the vessel. "I'll be down in a minute," he called. No Name grunted. "We have to go," he bellowed. "In a minute," Nico called back, vanishing below deck and emerging a moment later with a small canvas bag. He hopped down onto the sand, shooting a grin at No Name. "Okay, I am ready." "Where are we going?" Grace asked, eyeing the oncoming patrol boats. The bold mercenary looked around, spotting a house a couple 100 yards away. There were a couple dozen zombies between them and the house. "Push through them and get to the house," No Name instructed. "Don't kill them, though." Eddie's brow furrowed. "Why the hell not?" he asked. "Because we can barricade the door and the patrol will have to fight through them if they want to get to us," No Name explained. Hawk nodded, smacking Eddie on the back. "Good for me. Let's go," he urged. The group ran up the beach towards the zombies as the boat engines grew louder and louder in the distance. No Name and Kemp led the charge beside each other with lowered shoulders to create a path through the beasts like a fullback blocking for their running back. Machine gun fire went off in the distance, bullets sending puffs of sand into the air as it peppered the beach close to their feet. A few of the rounds hit some ghouls, ripping through torsos but not killing any outright. "Keep moving," No Name bellowed. The two mercenaries reached the house and ran up the stairs towards the front door as the rest of the group followed. The stairs were long, about 10 yards, leading up to the house on stilts. They paused briefly before busting in, No Name saying a silent prayer that the house would be safer than outside. They raced through the house, guns up, clearing it without any worry for noise. The civilians poured into the house, but Nico paused on the porch as zombies gathered below. He watched the boats land on the shore, about 70 yards away, and pulled an explosive device from his bag, flipping a switch to arm it before tossing it towards the back of the amassing horde. Bullets punched into the front of the house, and Nico growled, raising his machine gun and opening fire wildly. "You fucking fuckers!" he hollered. "Come get some!" Hawk stepped out of the door as the frame exploded in a hail of splinters from the bullet impacts. He grabbed Nico by the back of the shirt and hauled him inside, slamming the door behind him. "Are you crazy?" Hawk snapped. The captain straightened his shirt with a grin.
"Of course I am, my friend," he said, eyes wide. "Life is so much more interesting when you are."
He laughed and patted Hawk on the cheek. More bullets pierced the front of the house, and Hawk shook his head, grabbing the captain's arm and dragging him deeper into the building. They entered the relative safety of the kitchen where the others were.
"Kemp, need eyes on the hostiles," No Name said.
His partner stayed low, crawling into the living room as bullets continued to punch through the front of the house. When he reached the window, he peeked out at the veritable war zone outside. There were a few dozen zombies amassed out front, and nearly a dozen armed mercenaries pushed forward through them. Several of the men took aim at the monsters, systematically taking them down, while others continued firing at the house.
"Dozen or so hostiles pushing forward,"
Kemp called. He looked back towards the boats as a few more mercenaries jumped down and ran to their comrades.
"More incoming." "The horde?"
"Slowing them down, but not by much," Kemp replied. Even as the bullets flew, Nico rushed over to the window, taking up position by the ducked mercenary. His eyes lit up with mischief as a few of the men took out ghouls near the stairs and continued moving forward. The captain pulled out a detonator. Kemp's brow furrowed. "Do I want to know what that does?" he asked. Nico grinned deviously, flipping a switch to arm the device.
"Commander, we gotta move soon,"
Kemp called.
"Put down suppressing fire,"
No Name called back and pointed to Hawk and Eddie.
"Get in there and help," he instructed. "Just hold them at bay until we have a plan."
The two of them ran into the living room, setting up by a couple of windows, and fired towards the mercenaries coming their way. One took a bullet in the leg and the others retreated a bit, though still kept shooting at the house.
"You've been on the island,"
No Name said, turning to Grace.
"Where can we go?"
She motioned wildly with one hand. "I'm pretty sure there were a few boats by the house we were sent to last week," she replied. "But it's a hike."
"Is there anything between here and there that we can use?"
he asked. She shrugged. "Just a golf course with a decent-sized clubhouse," she said.
"It's going to have to do,"
he said. "There's a trail running through the woods out back," she suggested. "If we can make it to that, then it's a straight shot to the north of the island."
No Name whistled loudly. "Kemp, get in here," he bellowed.
His partner broke away from the window as the gunfight continued.
"What is it, Commander?"
he asked. No Name shoved the canvas bag of weapons towards him across the counter.
"I want you and Kenny to get out the back and find the trail in the woods," he instructed. "Keep going north until you hit the golf course. When you get there, start making all the noise you can. Gunshots, explosions, whatever you can come up with. We're going to be coming in hot and won't have much of a chance unless those boys outside have more than us to deal with. We won't be far behind."
They nodded and headed for the back door, readying their guns, canvas bag in tow.
"Shamblers out there,"
Kemp called, surveying the area through the window and spotting a few zombies lumbering around. "I'll secure the door," Grace said and grabbed the handle, giving them a nod before pulling it open. As soon as the men were clear, Kemp raised his gun and popped a few ghouls in the head while darting past outstretched arms. Kenny sprinting along behind him. A moment later they vanished into the woods, and she closed and checked the door to make sure it wouldn't budge. She peeked outside, watching most of the zombies following the duo into the trees, but a few staggered back towards the house. "This door is about to get crowded," she warned, turning back to the kitchen.
"Get Troy here ready to go,"
No Name said, inclining his head to their friend, who was getting paler by the minute.
"I'm fine. Just point me in the right direction,"
Troy insisted. The bold mercenary pointed to Austin.
"You're on Troy duty," he declared.
The young man nodded, and Troy opened his mouth to object, but he saw the look in No Name's eyes. He could plainly see the insinuation there that Austin needed something to focus on, so he stayed engaged and not lost in mourning Jackie. He nodded. No Name headed back into the living room, sidling up next to Nico to scope out the battle outside. Most of the zombies had been put down, and the mercenaries looked like they were preparing to push towards the house.
"We have to move before they get in here," the bold mercenary said.
Hawk and Eddie fired off a few more rounds before breaking away from the windows and going back to the kitchen. Nico, meanwhile, continued to stare out the window, watching as the last zombie fell and the mercenaries began to push forward.
"Come on, Captain. We have to go,"
No Name urged. Nico held up a single finger while continuing to stare outside. He watched several mercenaries grow close to the mob of ghouls they'd just put down. No Name raised an eyebrow and followed the captain's gaze, trusting the man who had rescued them thus far. Finally, Nico hit the detonator, sending a deafening boom throughout the house, shattering the glass that was still attached to the windows. Body parts, both zombie and mercenary, flew through the air. Moans and screams filled the void before bullets began to hit the house again. No Name peered outside, spotting a few mercs on the ground, missing limbs. Their comrades pushed forward to pull them out of harm's way.
"You are a crazy bastard," No Name said, shaking his head. "I like it. Come on, we gotta go."
He tugged on Nico's arm, and this time the captain followed, and they rushed to the back of the house. Grace stood by the back door, gun in hand. "I got the left, you get the right," she said, nodding to Hawk. He returned it, and as soon as she flung open the door, he darted out to the right. The duo quickly took aim and fired, killing the few zombies that were right by the door. The group followed them out, No Name bringing up the rear. As he stepped over the threshold, there was a battering at the front door, which was a straight shot to where he stood. He turned and fired several rounds through it. He didn't know if he hit anything, but the banging stopped, which would buy them a precious few seconds. He followed the others into the woods, rushing towards the trail, hoping that Kemp and Kenny were successful in their leg of the mission. Chapter 4. 30 minutes before dawn. The sky grew brighter as the sun slowly made its way to the horizon. Terrell led in a vehicle by himself, while Coleman and Dante drove behind him. They took the time to appreciate the view as they drove on a dirt road towards the plantation house. "Any other time, this would be cause to crack open the final beer of the night and enjoy the light show," Coleman said, shaking his head. Dante chuckled. "I'm on the opposite end of that spectrum," he said. "I'd be prepping for a run right about now." "You know, I never understood the mentality behind that," Coleman huffed, shaking his head. "Why in the world would you want to leave a cozy warm bed and exercise before the sun is up?" Dante gaped at him for a moment, confused. "I would have thought that a member of Delta would be used to getting up before the sun," he said. "Going on training exercises and missions and whatnot." "Oh, I have. Which is how I know I hate it with every fiber of my being," the soldier declared. "The only time I want to be awake when the sun is coming up is when I've had one hell of a night." Dante chuckled. "Fair enough," he said. "But seriously, though," Coleman said, cocking his head, "why in the world would you willingly get up that early to go on a run?" At first, it wasn't exactly willingly. Dante trailed off and pointed to the burn scars on his face. "Right after the incident, the doctors prescribed me a whole host of heavy-duty painkillers. I took them for about a week before giving it up because they were turning me into a zombie." They both paused, and then Coleman gave him a playful side-eye, blinking at him rapidly. "In my defense," Dante insisted, holding up a hand, "I've been telling this story for years, so in my world, zombie used to mean slow-moving and mindless, not these things we've been fighting." Coleman laughed. "I'm just fucking with you, man," he admitted, rolling his hand in the air. "Go on." "Well, without the pain meds, I had trouble sleeping," Dante continued. "By 5 in the morning, I was usually wide awake. First few days just moped around, scrolling the internet and watching kung fu movies on TV. The soldier raised an eyebrow. "So what broke you out of the rut?" he asked. Dante smiled sadly. "Grace," he said, voice soft. "She encouraged you to get back out there and training?" Coleman asked. Dante chuckled, pursing his lips for a moment in memory. "In a manner of speaking," he finally said. "She let me slide for a few days, but after that she started to let the ridicule in. It was a slow trickle at first, but soon enough it was a relentless barrage. With what happened to our parents, it didn't feel right to return fire. So I started getting off my ass and out the door every morning just to get her to shut up." Coleman smiled, nodding in approval. "She sounds like a good sister, man," he said, "looking forward to meeting her." "She is a great sister," Dante agreed wistfully. "Ultimately, though, there was a part of her that regretted encouraging me." Coleman raised an eyebrow. "How so?" he asked. "Well, as I started getting into shape, I started eating healthier. he explained with a smirk, which meant when I cooked, she started eating healthier too. Wasn't long before she was begging for a return to syrup-soaked French toast and pancakes. Coleman laughed. Nothing like a little passive-aggressive revenge, he declared. Tyrrell's vehicle stopped about 30 yards short of the plantation house, and Coleman slowed to a stop behind him. The building was massive, 2 stories and several thousand square feet. It looked like it was worse for wear, like nobody had lived there for several years. What was concerning, however, were the half-dozen vehicles parked outside of it. Tyrrell walked back towards the duo, who got out of their SUV quickly. "What do you think, Cap?" Coleman asked, crossing his arms. Tyrrell stared at the cars, noting a few of the doors were still wide open. "Check the doors," he instructed. "Looks like we had some survivors take refuge here, and it didn't end well." "Oh, goody," Coleman said with a sigh. "Looks like we have an infestation to deal with." Tyrrell smacked him on the shoulder. "Come on, buddy. Where's your optimism?" he asked. "They could very easily be wandering around in the fields to attack us at any given time." "Thanks, Cap. Super helpful," Coleman replied. "Anytime," Tyrrell replied with a grin. "Anytime." "Guess if we're going to hole up here, we should clear it out," Coleman said dryly. Dante pursed his lips for a moment. "Might want to go melee with it," he said. "Why?" the sniper asked, holding up his gun. "We got plenty of firepower." Dante inclined his head towards Tyrrell. "Just in case your captain there is right, and they are out there in the fields," he explained. "We're going to have enough on our hands with QXR. Don't need to be fighting a 2-front war." "You heard the man," Tyrrell declared. "Get something to crack some skulls." Coleman chuckled and shook his head, following Dante back to the SUV. He opened the back and they pulled out a couple of baseball bats. Tyrrell did the same with his vehicle, and the trio strolled up to the plantation house with their blunt weapons in hand, admiring the sunrise in the distance. Dante clenched his jaw, his breath hitching with worry. "Don't worry about Grace, man," Tyrrell said softly. "We're gonna get her." Dante sighed. "I know," he replied. "Just seeing that sun come up makes me worry for her. It's a lot easier to escape under cover of darkness." "She's with professionals," Tyrrell assured him. "They'll get her out." Dante nodded, unable to trust his voice, and pressed the issue further. He knew it wouldn't do any good anyway, since there was nothing he could do or change about her situation. All he could do was focus on his own part, which was clearing this giant house. When they reached the front door, it was shut tight. Tyrrell inclined his head to Coleman and the sniper trotted up the stairs. He turned the knob and it moved all the way, but when he pushed on the door, it didn't budge. "Unlocked, but something is blocking it from the inside," he reported. "Let's check the windows," Tyrrell suggested. "See what we can see." They spread out along the front of the house, checking the windows. Heavy blackout curtains hung over the panes, making it impossible to see inside. Before long, the trio reconvened at the front of the house. "So much for that idea," Coleman said with a sigh. "I think it's safe to assume someone or something is inside," Dante added, shaking his head. Coleman looked to Tyrrell. "How do you want to go about it, Cap?" he asked. Tyrrell contemplated for a moment before shrugging and heading for the door. "We're some big boys," he said over his shoulder. "Let's put our backs into it and push. Besides, I'd much rather deal with zombies in a hallway and on my feet rather than flat on my ass stuck in a curtain." Coleman smirked and playfully smacked Dante on the shoulder. "Hope you didn't skip leg day on those early morning workouts," he drawled. The 3 men headed up to the front of the house, getting into position to push on the front door. Coleman turned the knob, unlatching it, and they heaved. It took a few moments of force before the door finally began to budge. "Push!" Tyrrell roared. "We got this!" Finally, it was open wide enough so that Dante could slip inside. He peeked through first, making sure nothing was waiting for him right at the entrance. When he found nothing and heard nothing, he slid in. There was a heavy wooden dresser against the door, and he shoved it to the side so that Tyrrell and Coleman could walk in, instead of wriggling through the gap. Sunlight bathed the interior entryway, revealing a long hallway leading to stairs with several sets of doors on either side. Looks like instead of keeping those things out, they locked themselves inside with those things, Coleman murmured, shaking his head. The entryway was a bloodbath. Bodies were strewn everywhere, blood splattered across the walls and floor. 3 corpses lay on the ground, some with bite marks, and all with gaping head wounds. As the trio moved through the carnage, they studied the bodies. At least somebody figured out how to take these things down, Dante said. Coleman sighed. Better late than never, I guess, he quipped. Let's see if there are any survivors before we start saying that kind of stuff, Tyrell suggested firmly. They spread out, each of them taking a door. Dante opened his slowly, the door closest to the front. It creaked loudly, ending any element of surprise, so he threw it open and raised his bat immediately to strike. Much to his relief, the room was empty, with no signs of a struggle. He peered around, but there was no movement whatsoever, and his shoulders relaxed. They tensed right back up, however, at a slamming sound and a panicked yell. "Need some help!" Coleman cried. Dante tore down the hallway to find the sniper struggling to pull a door closed. Several sets of hands wrapped around the edge, trying to yank it open into the room. Before Dante or Tyrell could reach him, the knob snapped free of the door, sending Coleman tumbling back to the ground. A stream of zombies immediately poured from the door, lunging with arms outstretched for Coleman, who struggled to scramble back to his feet. Dante reached the horde first, lowering his shoulder and launching himself at the lead duo of creatures almost at Coleman's legs. He crashed into them like a linebacker taking out a ball handler, sending all 3 of them crashing to the floor. The extra space gave the sniper a chance to get back to his feet, and Tyrell reached the scrum. Dante struggled to keep the zombies from biting him, pinning them to the floor with his weight. The captain began swinging, cracking the 2 skulls one after the other and then taking out 2 more that were trying to get him from behind. As soon as they were clear, he grabbed Dante by the arm and yanked him to his feet. They whipped around as Coleman launched into battle. The sniper swung hard, cracking open the side of a skull. As the corpses dropped to the floor, he glanced into the room he'd liberated. "It's packed," he bellowed. "Move back!" Tyrell looked around frantically, laying his eyes on the stairs. "Get to the stairs!" he cried. The trio rushed back to the stairwell, which led straight up to the 2nd floor with no landing. It was wide enough for 4 people to be shoulder to shoulder, which would be handy to create a defensive line against the clumsy creatures. At the top of the stairs there was a small hallway on either side that led around to the main hallway back down to the front of the house. When they reached halfway up, they stopped, the soldiers ready for the onslaught of creatures as Dante turned around. "I'm going to check upstairs," he said. Tyrell nodded. "If there's anything up there, do what you can to hold them off until we can get the situation under control." Dante gave him a thumbs up and then thundered up the stairs with haste, pausing at the top step when he heard banging from down the hall. He approached the railing almost in slow motion, his eyes widening at the sight of a dozen creatures breaking free from a bedroom and tearing towards him. "We're about to have a lot of company," he roared, raising his bat. "Shit," Tyrell grunted as he kicked a zombie down the stairs. "Do what you can." Dante took a deep breath, attempting to steady his brain. There wasn't a way to block off the stairs, at least not in a way he could attempt with so little time. He reached out and shook the rickety wooden banister, finding it loose. He approached the left side and raised his bat, whacking away at it. A couple of well-placed strikes, and he was able to kick the whole thing free of the main banister. "What are you doing?" Coleman grunted as he smacked a ghoul in the forehead, sending a limp corpse sliding back down into its brethren. "Dealing with it," Dante barked as the railing clattered to the floor below. He moved to the right side of the stairs, gripping his bat tightly, but not in a swinging position. He readied himself as the first few zombies came around the corner at the top of the stairs. He waited until they were a few steps down, with the one closest to him a few steps ahead of the other 2, more forming a line at the top. Dante put the top of his bat into the lead creature's chest, holding it at bay for a moment, so the other 2 could stumble down to his level. Once they caught up, he pushed hard, sending the lead ghoul slamming back into the others, driving the creatures all back towards the left and through the gaping hole in the banister. Once the momentum started, they weren't able to stop tumbling through the hole to the ground below. A sickening crunch echoed, and Dante was unsure of whether it was a kill shot or not, but at least they were no longer an immediate threat. He turned back towards the top of the stairs where several more ghouls began their descent. The first one stumbled, falling face first on the wooden stairs and cracking its face open. Dante didn't waste any time, driving his bat down into the back of its head and crushing its skull. The next creature managed the first couple of stairs okay, but before Dante could use his bat to guide it to the opening, it fell forward, forcing him to leap out of the way as it went head over heels down the stairs. "Incoming!" he yelled, his heart leaping into his throat. Tyrell turned just in time to spot the tumbling ghoul and jump out of the way. The corpse flopped right past him, smacking into a small group of creatures at the bottom of the stairs. "I can handle this, Cap. Go help him," Coleman cried, and Tyrell nodded, racing back up the stairs as Dante swung at individual zombies staggering down towards him. "Let's start throwing them off," Tyrell suggested from behind him. "It's starting to get a little crowded up here." Dante nodded, and they began grabbing creatures as they came down and shoving them along to the hole in an undead assembly line. It took several minutes, but finally the corpses stopped coming. "Do a sweep upstairs," the captain instructed. "I'm going to help Coleman clean up." Dante nodded, chest heaving a bit from the intense fighting. He walked up to the top of the stairs, looking back down the hallway, relieved to find it completely empty. There was only a single open door near the middle. He moved towards it, ready to strike if anything came out. When he reached it, he peered in and nearly gagged at the sight before him. There were several mostly eaten corpses on the ground, rotten and bloated. A few moved ever so slightly, not having enough muscle mass to be a threat, but still with enough intact brain to be partially alive. Dante swallowed bile and shut the door, moving back to the stairwell. "We're good up here," he said hoarsely. Tyrell and Coleman struck a few more times, ending the threat inside the house. The trio all stood still for a few moments, taking a breath and making sure nothing else was going to pop out of the woodwork. When they were confident that wasn't going to happen, they began to walk towards the front door. Once outside, they stood in silence on the large front porch for a time, looking to the north. The sun rose to their right, bathing the world in a misleading, beautiful hue. "Well," Coleman finally said, breaking the silence, "that was fun." Tyrell took a deep breath. "I'm afraid that's just the warm-up for today, buddy," he drawled. "Always the bastion of optimism, Cap," the sniper quipped. "It's appreciated." "So, what now?" Dante asked, flexing his fingers. "Coleman, I want you to get the vehicles pulled up to the west side of the house," Tyrell said. "Park them right to the windows so we can sneak out and hit the road if we have resistance." "On it," the sniper replied and jogged down the front steps to follow his orders. Dante cocked his head. "And me?" he asked. "Well, you and I are going to use these abandoned cars to form a perimeter around the front entrance," Tyrell replied. "The house has good cover, but I'll never say no to a solid firing line." Dante nodded, heading for the steps. "Mark it out, and let's get pushing," he said. The captain nodded, and they got to work, moving quickly. Today, the threat of a fight was always right around the corner. Chapter 5. Dawn. No Name led the group through the woods as quickly as he could. They'd moved nearly a mile through the woods towards the golf course, the sounds of gunshots echoing in the distance. "Keep your eyes peeled," he called over his shoulder. "If those things are nearby, they're going to be headed towards the noise." Grace huffed behind him. "At least we know they're alive and kicking," she said. "Either that or we've been flanked," No Name muttered. "Comforting," she quipped. He shook his head. He couldn't afford to be tactful on today of all days. They had to be pragmatic and think of all options. "How much farther is the course?" he asked. "Can't be more than a quarter mile or so," she replied. As they continued their push, a gunshot went off behind them, and the bold mercenary skidded to a stop, motioning wildly for everyone to take cover. He pulled out his gun, aiming it back down the trail. The low hovering sun illuminated things a bit, but this deep in the woods, still so early in the day, it was difficult to see. "We should keep moving," Grace hissed. No Name continued to stare into the distance, looking for anything that might have been moving. After a tense few moments, he didn't see anything and motioned for the group to get moving again.
"Grace, lead them out," he instructed.
She nodded and broke from cover, Eddie, Hawk, and Nico right behind her. Austin and Troy were about 10 yards behind, and as soon as they stepped out onto the trail, gunshots echoed. A bullet tore through Austin's gut, dropping him to the ground. He screamed, but it was drowned out by a torrent of gunfire. Troy dove for the young man, grabbing him by his shirt collar and dragging him back into the trees as No Name provided covering fire. He spotted movement about 40 yards back, along with muzzle flashes. It was difficult to get a good shot through the trees, and all he could do was pin the mercenaries down.
"Troy, how are we looking?"
No Name called through the trees.
"Shit, kid, that doesn't look good,"
Troy muttered, his heart rate tripling at the sight of blood. So much blood. Austin winced, drawing in a staggering breath, raising a shaky hand. Troy grabbed it, holding it tightly, wincing at the pain from his own wound, still so fresh.
"Looks like we're gunshot buddies now, huh?"
he joked, forcing a smile, but it didn't distract the kid. Austin's eyes were wide as he stared at him desperately.
Don't let them take me," he stammered hoarsely. "Don't let them take me."
Troy swallowed hard. He shook his head. It was unlikely that Austin was going to survive anyway. But if he did, or if they caught him with enough of his life left, what was left of it would be horribly unpleasant. He'd end up in the arena, or maybe worse, given the shit they'd pulled that day. Troy raised his gun with his good hand, not letting go of Austin's with his bad one. "I'm glad we met," he whispered. "You and Jackie." He pressed the barrel of his gun against the kid's temple, and Austin's eyes fluttered closed as he waited for the end. Troy's shoulder suddenly exploded in pain, and he jerked forwards. It took him a moment to realize that it was a bullet in the same arm that had already been hit, and he spun around. His head swam, and he fell back onto his ass, his back pressed against Austin's front. The kid groaned in pain, but Troy was focused on the mercenary aiming at them. His heart leapt into his throat, but the merc's gun clicked empty, and he took his chance, raising his weapon as his opponent scrambled for his sidearm. Troy fired, emptying half of his magazine into the enemy. Most of the shots hit Vest, but one found his throat, sending the mercenary to the ground gurgling on his last breath. Trees exploded everywhere from bullet impacts, and Troy began to feel like he wasn't going to make it out of this. It was clear that No Name wouldn't be able to make it to them, and he didn't think he'd be able to move without assistance.
"Troy!"
No Name bellowed, and the dazed and bleeding man turned his head lazily, managing to catch sight of a flash of bald head, taking cover. He was still too far away.
"Go!"
Troy called, injecting as much bravado into his voice as he possibly could.
"I'll hold them as long as I can."
No Name let out a frustrated-sounding yell. Troy imagined the guy was weighing his options, but clearly put two and two together, that if he tried to push forward, he'd get taken out too. Not to mention their injuries, with Austin's shallow grunting breaths and the sheer volume of blood pouring from Troy's own shoulder. He didn't think they'd make it very far anyway. If No Name didn't catch up to the others, the group's chance of escaping would be exponentially lower than with his expertise. No Name managed to peek out at him, and their eyes locked. He gave Troy a solemn nod, his gaze saying, "Thank you for your sacrifice." Or at least, that's what Troy imagined it said.
"Wait till I cover you,"
he said sternly, and grabbed his assault rifle with his remaining useful arm. He adjusted himself so that he was leaning against a tree instead of crushing Austin, letting out a scream of pain as he fired back towards the mercenaries. As soon as his first shot went off, No Name took off running. Trees still exploding, but not as much as before. Once he was out of sight, Troy emptied his mag. All he could do now was hope they made it, and do as good of a job as he could to hold these assholes off as long as he could. He struggled to reload with one working hand, grunting as he pulled a new mag from his shirt pocket and balanced the gun between his knees. He slapped the mag in, glancing at Austin, who lay slumped, chin on his chest. Troy didn't know if he had passed out or was dead, but there was no time now to worry about it. He chambered the first round. There was a solid thump on the ground next to him. He glanced down at a grenade spinning ever so slightly on the dirt. His eyes widened.
God motherfucking damn it.
Chapter 6. No Name pumped his legs hard, grunting in frustration at the sound of a grenade going off. If that was the mercenaries blowing up Troy and Austin, and he was sure it was, then he didn't have much of a head start. When he reached the clearing at the golf course, his stomach sank. It was a war zone. About 60 zombies were on the course, all of which were moving towards the clubhouse. Gunfire came from inside, but only from the door, where a mass of bodies was converging.
Guess they're trying to plug the hole,
he muttered, and slung his rifle over his shoulder, pulling out his handgun before taking off running once again. He rushed towards the clubhouse, darting between zombies and avoiding their agitated, outstretched hands. He arced away from the club, about 20 yards from the building. When he got closer, he fired a few shots in the air to get the survivors' attention. He continued to run towards the northern tree line, staying as far away from the bulk of the ghouls as he could. However, there were a few that were definitely too close for comfort, so he holstered his sidearm and drew his knife. He went to work on 3 nearby ghouls, striking violently. He stabbed one in the temple and then grabbed the corpse and threw it towards the other 2. As they fell to the ground, he ran and leapt into the air, bringing his boot heel down hard onto one of their faces while stabbing the other one in the forehead. Mere seconds after it began, the confrontation was over. He sheathed his knife and pulled his rifle from his back, aiming it towards the clubhouse and watching as the survivors broke out a window and hopped outside, running his way. They were all moving quickly, and thankfully only a few zombies broke away from the building to pursue them. He stared down the barrel, making sure that no zombies were getting too close to his pack. A few moments later they reached the tree line, and he motioned wildly for everyone to get behind cover. Grace ignored the order, stopping beside him with hard eyes. "Where are Troy and Austin?" she demanded. No Name didn't move from his scope, keeping an eye on the ghouls, his jaw set. "Where are they?" she snapped, voice rising. He relented finally, looking down at her and shaking his head. She ground her teeth together so hard he could hear them squeak, her eyes glassing up. She growled under her breath, but the noise came out thick.
"Come on, we have to keep moving,"
No Name said firmly, and turned, making sure she followed him into the trees. She kept a fist clenched, gun tight in her other hand, eyes downcast as she kept up with him.
"How did you get the zombies to stay at the clubhouse?"
the bold mercenary asked as he caught up with Kemp.
"Talk to Kenny," his partner said dryly.
No Name turned his attention on the football player and he cocked his head. "Figured it might be in our best interests if your former friends thought we were still in the building," Kenny explained. "There were a couple of old-style wind-up clocks, so I set the alarm. Thank God those rich folks who came here liked that old-timey stuff."
"Old money likes old things," No Name said. "But that's some good thinking."
Kenny shrugged. "Just doing my part," he said. Grace marched past everyone, moving with purpose, and No Name jutted out his chin as he watched her tense form, knowing she was struggling with the loss of her friends. As they moved through the woods towards the northern trail, gunfire echoed from the clubhouse.
"Shit, they got there quick," Kemp said.
Kenny shook his head. "Won't be long before they realize we aren't inside," he added. A loud boom went off in the distance, making more than a few of them jump.
"Jesus, they're not messing around," Hawk muttered.
"Which means we better have a plan to slow them down while we get that boat in the water,"
Eddie said.
"Assuming there's still one there," Hawk said.
Grace sneered over her shoulder. "Maybe we can leave someone else behind to cover us," she snapped. No Name clenched his jaw as the rest of the group lapsed into an awkward silence. He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of her. He watched her shoulders quiver with anger and kept his tone to the point, but gentle.
"Austin was cut in half, and Troy took multiple rounds," he said. "I tried to get to him, but even if I had, he wouldn't have made it. He sacrificed his life so that I could keep helping you."
Her shoulders slumped, but she nodded. "I'm sorry," she said hoarsely. He put a hand on her arm.
"It's okay," he assured her. "I'd be pissed off if I were in your position too. But right now, we need a plan."
"Good thing I'm still kicking then," she said, taking a deep breath and looking up at him. "Because I have one." She turned to the group. Captain Nico. He gave her a little wave. Yes, my dear? He asked brightly. Do you have any more explosives? She asked. He barked a laugh and winked at her. Oh, I love your sense of humor, my girl, he said, wagging a finger. Of course I have more explosives. He pulled his bag around the front as they continued to walk, opening it up to show her half a dozen more bombs. What kind do you desire? Timed? Remote detonated? Big? Small? I think in this situation something small and timed will do the trick, she said. Excellent, he declared, and reached in, rummaging around for a moment before pulling out a small pipe bomb with plastic zip ties around it. If you need to attach it to something, there you go. Just punch in the time, hit the green button, and don't be anywhere near it when it hits 0. Thank you, Captain, she said with a nod. We'll be setting sail by then. Okay, I'm intrigued, No Name cut in, raising an eyebrow. What are we blowing up? Grace simply smiled and picked up the pace. The group followed suit, and within a few minutes they were out of the woods, emerging into a sunlit open area. Zombie moans echoed nearby, and everyone tensed. They glanced over towards the mansion that Grace and her team had raided before, and at the fence were easily 50 zombies, all milling about and agitated by the fresh meals moving around. The group walked towards them to get to the other side of the house, where they hoped to find a boat that was on the water. When we were here last, we barely got out before being overwhelmed, Grace said. I managed to secure that gate before we left. She held up the bomb. With this, we'll be able to blow it open, flooding the road with those things. No Name shook his head. Those QXR boys will make quick work of them, though, he said. I'm sure they will, but it should be all the time we need to get offshore, she replied. More gunshots went off in the distance, and everyone's pace picked up even more. Kemp, get everyone to the boats, No Name barked. Pretty sure I saw some on the far side of this house, Grace explained. We're right on the shore. No Name pointed. You heard her. Go, he said. We'll handle the welcome gift. All right, everybody, let's move, Kemp said, and took off at a jog, herding the rest along with him. No Name and Grace ran to the fence which had attracted most of the zombies in the yard. They were agitated, pushing against the gate and reaching through at them. Watch yourself, the bold mercenary said as the gate bowed. I don't know if that's going to hold. Just need it to hold for a few minutes, she said as she secured the bomb. How long should I put the timer for? A shot rang out in the distance and a bullet impacted the ground next to No Name after bouncing off of the fence. 30 seconds sounds about right, he said hurriedly, and broke away from her, rushing towards the road. He took a knee at the edge of the fence, aiming back towards the trail where he knew the mercenaries would be emerging. He took aim, firing at a duo coming up the center of the road. His first shot hit the mercenary on the left directly in the chest, knocking him to the ground. His vest protected him from death, but he was clearly in pain. His partner fired at No Name, forcing him to hit the deck, protecting his head behind a metal post in the fence. He returned fire, peppering the ground where his opponents were, forcing them to retreat as the rest of their friends began to emerge from the woods. Grace readied the explosive, typing in 30 seconds on the timer. Before she hit the green start button, she tried to attach the ties to the chain, but there were too many zombie hands reaching for her. She shook her head and hit the button, tossing it on the ground about a foot away from the gate. Close enough, she cried, and took off running. As soon as she reached the road, No Name popped up and grabbed her around the waist, pulling her back as bullets flew their way. We're on the clock, Grace cried. No Name opened fire towards the mercenaries down the road, about 40 yards away. They were along the side of the road behind cover, making them difficult to hit. He didn't care about kill shots, rather just wanting them to stop shooting long enough for them to get the hell away from the pipe bomb. Go, now, he hissed, and Grace darted out from what little cover they had and took off running. No Name followed, but backpedaled, still shooting to keep the enemy pinned. Grace reached the edge of the fence, making a turn towards the water. Bullets pinged against the metal posts, and she ducked as No Name emptied the remainder of his magazine around the corner, dropping it out and slamming in a fresh one as he caught up to her. He looked back towards the far end of the road, seeing several men emerge from cover and rushing towards them. He scurried towards the water's edge, about 50 yards away. Grace reached the boat and Kemp looked to No Name. He waved wildly. Go, go, go! he yelled as he continued to run full tilt. Kenny and Kemp hopped into the water and pushed the small pontoon boat away from shore. Immediately they fired up the engine and began moving away from land. As No Name ran, the bomb detonated, the resounding boom followed by a torrent of gunshots. He stopped just before the water, turning to fire several times at mercenaries coming around the fence, apparently leaving the zombie cleanup to their comrades. His bullets found their mark, striking a mercenary in the leg and dropping him to the ground. A couple of others returned fire as he dove into the shallow water, quickly swimming towards the others, who were about 30 yards offshore. Kemp, Hawk, and Eddie stood on the edge of the boat, their guns trained on the shoreline. The mercenaries made a play for the extra boat they'd left behind as Kenny hauled No Name out of the water. As soon as the bold mercenary was aboard, Nico went full throttle, kicking up water as they quickly picked up steam.
"Why aren't you shooting?"
No Name huffed as he sat up.
"And why did you leave that other boat?"
The men smirked and shook their heads. Kenny pointed at Nico, who held up a detonator, wiggling it.
"Kenny, please, take over," the captain declared.
The football player got behind the wheel, guiding the boat towards the mainland, and Nico stepped up next to No Name, sitting down beside him as they watched the mercenaries push the boat into the water. 4 of them got in, and the engine roared to life as they began pursuit.
"You know, my friend, for a bunch of supposedly highly trained men, the situational awareness is somewhat lacking,"
Nico said, as conversational as if they were discussing the weather.
"If I were in pursuit of me, I would have checked around the edge of the boat before getting on board."
He flicked the switch on the detonator to arm it.
"Sometimes the thrill of the hunt gets the better of you,"
No Name said, cocking a brow. Nico smirked.
"I hope they enjoyed it, because it's the last thing they'll get to do,"
he said, and hit the button, followed immediately by a deafening blast and a fireball reaching for the sky.
"Let's see them follow us now."
"They won't, but their friends will," No Name said.
"In that case, we really should be moving faster,"
Nico declared, and the 2 men turned to Kenny. He nodded. "Full speed ahead it is," he replied, and pushed the throttle to the max. Chapter 7. Kenny piloted the mile to shore, which was a wetland area with no visible beach.
"Just punch it and run us aground,"
No Name instructed. Kenny nodded firmly. "All right, you all hold on to your butts," he said, and kept the throttle at full. The rest of the group braced themselves for impact. The boat didn't have as much intensity as Nico's craft, being only a pontoon boat and all, but it was still sailing pretty quickly. As soon as the bottom scraped against the rocks below, it let out a horrific shrieking noise just below the water's surface. Finally, the vessel lurched to a violent stop, sending everyone lurching forward. Kenny quickly cut the engine as No Name stood up.
"Okay, everybody out," he barked. "We have a hike ahead of us, and those boys aren't going to be too far behind."
Everyone secured their weapons, Nico still carrying his magic bag full of extras. They hit the ground running, pushing their way into the trees that led towards their destination. As they worked their way through the wetlands, noise erupted in the distance. Moaning. Kemp, who had taken point, raised his fist to stop everyone.
"We gotta keep moving,"
No Name urged from the rear. Kemp shot him a glance. "If it's all the same to you, Commander, I'd rather not get bitten," he quipped.
"Okay, check it out,"
No Name agreed and held up a hand.
"Silent kills only."
Kemp pulled out his knife, slinging his rifle over his back, and pushed some tree branches out of the way. On the other side were 6 zombies that were stuck up to the waist in muck. They thrashed about when they spotted Kemp, but couldn't move in the mud. "We're good," he announced. "Just watch your step." The group carefully traversed the goop, giving the trapped creatures a wide berth. When they finally reached dry land about 20 yards up, they took a knee as they trudged out of the deep gunk for a much-needed breather.
"It's like walking through quicksand,"
Hawk huffed. Eddie nodded. "Same concept, so yeah, might as well be," he agreed.
"How far up is this place, anyway?" Hawk asked.
No Name tilted his head back and forth.
"Couple miles, maybe," he replied.
Hawk let out a long, drawn-out sigh at the prospect of such a long walk. He looked down at his soaked and muddy frame and glanced over at Grace.
You know I love you, girl, he drawled, but if your brother isn't at this house with a ride, I'm going to find him and kick his ass.
She chuckled. Good luck with that, she quipped.
What, you don't think I could take him?
Hawk asked, blinking at her with faux offense. Hell no. He would put you in the ground before you knew you were even in a fight. Grace shot back and raised a palm. Lucky for you, however, if it came to that, you'd be waiting in line behind me for that ass-kicking, and Dante never gets away from me. The group laughed at her bravado, a moment of much-needed levity during such a stressful day.
Come on,
No Name said, getting to his feet, and everyone groaned as they peeled themselves from the ground and followed. They pushed on, finally emerging from the wooded area of the wetlands into a large field that seemingly stretched on for a mile. There wasn't a creature in sight, and they moved at a brisk pace.
So where does everybody want to go after we get out of this?
Hawk asked as they walked. Kemp sighed wistfully. Some tropical island in the Caribbean sounds about right, he said. Bahamas? Yeah, that sounds good. Oh, that's a great idea, Eddie said, rolling his eyes. Until a hurricane comes up out of nowhere. Damn, didn't think about that, Kemp said, snapping his fingers. Guess that would put a damper on things. But for those first few months, it would be golden. Kenny shook his head. I can't imagine what kind of shit show the people in the Bahamas are dealing with right now, he said, assuming there's anybody left. What are you talking about? Kemp asked, blinking at him. People on islands would have the best chance of surviving this thing, I would think. Kenny shook his head. Sure, as long as they're not within a few-hour boat ride from Miami, he pointed out. Man, that's where I started out. Those first few days you could see hundreds, hell, maybe even thousands of boats and yachts heading in that direction. Imagine being on that island and waking up one day only to see a floating army of zombies headed your way. He shuddered. Couldn't have been pretty. Okay, fine. Hawaii, then, Kemp said with exaggerated frustration, throwing up his hands. A chuckle rippled through the group. I could get down with some Hawaii, Kenny agreed. It would take 6 years of walking and swimming to get there, but hell, I don't have anything else going on. Hawk cocked his head. What about you, girl? He asked. Where do you want to go? Honestly, I just want to go home, Grace admitted. This is the longest I've ever been away from... She trailed off, suddenly realizing the absurdity of her wish. Even if they could somehow make it across the country, Seattle was a major city, and almost certainly completely infested with zombies. She sighed, chuckled, and shook her head. You okay? Eddie asked. Yeah, just didn't take long for reality to set in, Grace replied. We're barely surviving out here in the middle of nowhere. Can you imagine what it's like in a city the size of Seattle? There's probably nobody left alive up there. And even if there is, there's a good chance they wish they weren't. Kemp glanced at No Name with a smirk on his face, and the bold mercenary nodded at him, returning the smile. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Kemp asked, and Grace's eyes widened. She looked back and forth between the mercenaries with a mix of excitement and worry, unsure of which would be most appropriate for what he was insinuating. What? She demanded. What is it? Somebody tell me now.
You brought it up. You have at it, No Name said, raising his hands.
Kemp, Grace growled. You tell me now. Let me preface this by saying this is second-hand information, the mercenary insisted, taking an exaggerated step away from the fuming woman. But our main source within the government, or what's left of it at any rate, told us that the military has launched a massive operation in the hopes of creating a safe zone to start rebuilding. Grace's jaw dropped. Where? She asked. He grinned. Seattle, he replied. She stopped walking, her breath catching in her throat, tears springing to her eyes. Hawk slung an arm around her shoulders, giving them a reassuring squeeze, and finally urged her gently to keep moving. She nodded, taking a deep breath and offering him a smile of thanks. So, you're telling me that the military has liberated Seattle? She asked Kemp, blinking rapidly. He nodded. Last we heard was that the assault was underway, he explained. No word on how it was going. But it's the military. Surely they're going to be successful, right? Eddie piped up. Hawk shook his head.
Gotta be a few million of those things up there, he said. That's a tall order, even for our boys in uniform.
Yeah, but a few hundred of these assholes managed to take over a whole island. Eddie cut himself off, face reddening as he looked back and forth between the mercenaries. Sorry, I didn't mean you to, he amended quickly. No Name laughed.
Don't apologize, he said. We are assholes. That's why we're so good at our job.
Thanks, Eddie said, scratching the back of his head. But my point still stands, though. A few hundred guys can take over an island this size, then a few 100,000 troops shouldn't have any problem with Seattle. Our contact seemed hopeful, Kemp said. By sheer dumb luck, the virus seemed to have skipped over enough intelligent people at the top of the military food chain, so they should have a handle on things. Grace took a deep breath, looking at the sky. I can't believe going back home is an option, she said, heart leaping into her throat. She was afraid to hope, but she so wanted to hope. Definitely not the easiest option, though, Kenny cut in. That's a hell of a drive even without the zombie apocalypse going on. My first year in the league, we did a joint team scrimmage up in Dallas during training camp. Rookies always get hazed pretty hard, especially at the professional level. When it came time to fly home, us rookies weren't allowed to board. He shook his head. We were told we had to practice the next afternoon back in Miami, and we had to drive home. 6 guys our size in a car barely big enough for 5 regular people, driving for 20 hours straight. Pure nightmare fuel, let me tell you. He raised his palms to the heavens. And that's not even half the trip. We'd have to make from here to get up to Seattle. I'm not trying to dissuade you from going home, but you should be prepared for the journey. Driving in civilization is nothing, Nico piped up. You should try driving through the desert during windy season. I would have killed for a truck stop. Eddie snorted. Well, if we head to Seattle, we aren't going to have the luxury of truck stops, he said, or any other normal stops.
Or bridges over the Mississippi,
No Name added. Everyone fell silent with confusion and looked at the bold mercenary.
What the hell are you talking about, man?
Hawk finally asked.
Happened a couple of weeks ago, he said. The president was convinced to take out the bridges over the river.
Hawk gaped at him.
Why the hell would he do that? He demanded.
Most of the population in the country is on the East Coast, Kemp explained. Makes sense to cut them off, give the military a fighting chance over there. No Name took a deep breath.
I did hear something about a handful of bridges being left up in rural areas, he said hopefully. So you might be able to find a way across without swimming. But just something to keep in mind.
Lots of stuff to consider, Grace said, and then shook her head. But first, we have to get out of this mess. The group all nodded, continuing their walk in silence across the large field. There was a road a few 100 yards ahead, with trees starting about 50 yards up and dotting the landscape all the rest of the way. Everybody be quiet, Kemp suddenly said, urgency in his tone. The group all stopped dead in their tracks, staying silent as he listened hard for a few moments. In the silence, he wasn't the only one that could hear the faint sound of vehicles in the distance. "Run to the trees, now!" he bellowed, and nobody hesitated. They tore off behind him, making it about 15 yards before a trio of vehicles appeared down the road. The grass wasn't tall enough to hide them from view. Their only hope would be to get to the trees for cover. The SUV's engines revved, insinuating that they'd be spotted, and the survivors pumped their legs hard. When they were about 10 yards from the trees, gunfire erupted from the lead vehicle. The bullets weren't very accurate, hitting the ground a good 5 yards from the running group, but the impact still forced them to scatter in panic. They managed to get to the trees as the SUV slammed on the brakes on the road in front of them. Kemp and No Name took up positions in the lightly populated trees, a few yards between them, firing a few rounds downrange to pepper the vehicles with bullets as the mercenaries inside attempted to get out and take cover. As soon as they began firing at the mercenaries, bullets flew their way, sending wood shards flying everywhere. Grace took aim with her gun and opened fire, joining the 2 men, while the rest of the group struggled to get their weapons ready. The exchange went on for several moments before the mercenary side stopped firing. No Name held up his fist, making sure that everyone on his side ceased their defense. Well, 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 one of the mercenaries yelled from the convoy. Looks like we caught up to the traitors. I know you two have killed several good, honorable men today, so I can only hope that you haven't been dropped yet. I won that pleasure for myself. Kemp's brow furrowed. Who the hell is that? He hissed to his friends.
Sounds like Michaels,
No Name replied. Kemp wrinkled his nose. Let me guess. One of Mosley's underlings? He asked.
Yep,
the bald mercenary replied, nodding and then raised his voice.
Is that you, Michaels? Just want to know who I'm going to have to kill here in a minute.
Michaels barked a laugh. Well, you don't lack for confidence. I'll give you that, he called. You also don't lack in the ball department either, because only someone with beach ball-sized nuts would think they could do what you've done and live.
You'd be surprised to know what I've done and lived to tell about.
No Name yelled back.
Well, not exactly told about it, because they were covert ops, and I'm a professional. But my point still stands.
Making jokes just before you die, Michaels called. I hope when it's my time I can have your attitude.
No time like the present,
No Name quipped. Kemp twitched suddenly, his gaze moving to the right side of the SUV blockade. He clucked his tongue and No Name followed his gaze, spotting 3 mercenaries gearing up at the rear bumper of the last vehicle to prepare to make a move. No Name pointed out the men trying to flank them, so the rest of the group knew what to expect. He pointed to Hawk and Eddie, motioning that they should fire when the time came. Nico reached into his bag and pulled out a bomb, waving it proudly. No Name tongued his cheek and looked to Kemp.
How close are we to the rendezvous?
He asked. Can't be more than a half a mile, his partner replied. No Name nodded thoughtfully.
If Delta is in the house, they might not have heard the gunshots, he said.
Kemp inclined his head towards Nico. Bet they'll hear that, though, he said.
My thoughts exactly,
No Name said and glanced at the captain, giving him a nod of approval. Nico winked at him in response. You still with me there, traitor? Michaels bellowed.
Oh, I haven't gone anywhere,
No Name called back.
When I do, you'll know, because I'm going straight through you.
Were you this cocky back when you had a name? Michaels yelled.
Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't,
No Name replied, peeking through 2 branches to keep an eye on the enemy.
Wouldn't be doing my job if people knew the answer to that.
He watched Michaels raise his hand, and then he glanced over at the flanking strike group as they began to move. Well, it will have to be one of life's lost mysteries, then, Michaels yelled and opened fire, followed by the rest of his half-dozen men. No Name ducked as bullets peppered the trees, presumably less to strike targets and more to cover up the small flank team. Hawk and Eddie were ready, though, and had the men in their sights as they waited for them to get to the trees. As soon as they crossed to their side of the road, the duo started shooting, pinning them down. A fierce exchange of bullets began, with neither side being able to deliver a hit. As this went on, Nico moved a bit closer to the 3 mercenaries, using the trees as cover. When he was within 15 yards of them, he pulled out a lighter and lit the fuse on the bomb. When it was halfway down, he nodded to Hawk and Eddie, and they unleashed a torrent of bullets to pin the mercenaries down. Once they were behind cover, the crazed captain popped out from behind cover and whipped the bomb in their direction. "Surprise!" he bellowed, watching the bomb bounce a few times on the ground and skip between 2 trees, right behind the enemy. They scrambled back towards the road, opening them up to Hawk and Eddie. The lead mercenary narrowly avoided being shot, but the middle one wasn't so lucky, taking a round in the side. He collapsed to the ground, scrambling to get back up. The man behind him tried to leap over him instead of stopping to help, and, as if karma itself swooped down, his foot caught on his staggering friend and sent them both to the ground. Before they could regain their footing, the bomb went off, vaporizing them and sending flames and smoke into the air through the trees. Hawk and Eddie ducked for cover, while Nico laughed maniacally, raising a fist in victory. The gunfire stopped, giving everyone a breather to reassess the situation. After several moments of silence, No Name cocked a brow.
"So, how did that flanking maneuver go, Michaels?" he called.
There was no answer from the other side, and he inclined his head to Kemp.
"Looks like we got his full attention now," he said softly to his partner.
Kemp chuckled. Not sure what mental asylum they broke that good captain out of, but I'm damn glad they did, he drawled.
"Same here,"
No Name agreed. So, what do you think they're doing? Kemp asked, inclining his head towards the enemy.
"We have to assume the worst," No Name said. "That he's smart enough to do what I would do in this situation."
Kemp raised an eyebrow. Which is? He asked.
"Call for reinforcements,"
No Name replied dryly. His friend's eyes grew round as saucers. They could barely deal with what they were fighting right now, let alone more mercenaries. In that case, we'd better hope Delta heard Captain Nico's signal, he said, shaking his head with worry. No Name simply nodded and continued aiming his gun at the caravan, paying special attention to the edges to make sure Michaels wasn't trying anything a second time.
"Come on, Delta. Don't let me down."
Chapter 8. The windows rattled in the whole house as something exploded in the distance. Tyrell, Dante, and Coleman rushed outside to try to discern the source of the blast. Towards the east, a black cloud rose into the sky, and Dante let out a strangled noise. Grace, he breathed. If they're doing that, then they're trying to send us a message, Coleman said. Tyrell nodded. Heard, loud and clear, he said, and ran back into the house, grabbing his assault rifle from the small table in the entryway. He checked the ammo before running back out the door. Wait up, I'll come with you, Coleman said, jumping out of the way as he'd been about to enter the house to do the same. No, I can handle it, Tyrell insisted. If they're that desperate, then there's a good chance we're going to be coming in hot. I'm going to need you two to provide cover. We'll be ready, Coleman promised. Dante took a deep breath. Go get Grace, he said firmly. Tyrell nodded, slinging the rifle over his shoulder and tearing off towards the smoke at a dead sprint. He pumped his legs as hard as he could, covering a ton of ground quickly. After several minutes, he slowed at the sight of the road and the glint of vehicles about 200 yards away. There were 3 SUVs with 7 men behind them, stretched out pretty evenly. He surveyed the area, seeing a small patch of trees to the right of the mercenaries, about 15 yards from them. He dropped into covert mode, moving quickly but silently, his footfalls soundless and flat on the ground as he raised his assault rifle just in case someone turned around. He made it to the trees without detection, concealing himself in the shade. He could see across the way where No Name and the others were held up, catching a flash of a movement behind the trees. He took out a small flashlight, holding it right beside the tree so that the light was obscured to the side where the mercenaries were, pointing in the direction of No Name. He rapidly clicked it on and off a couple of times before putting it down, not wanting to risk detection. This brief signal was enough to garner the attention of somebody, because a moment later No Name turned and locked eyes with the captain. They shared a nod, both understanding wordlessly what needed to be done. Tyrell readied for battle as he waited for the others to prepare, and then a moment later, without any warning, every single one of them opened fire, hitting the vehicles and forcing the QXR mercenaries behind cover. Bullets peppered the vehicles as well as the tires of all 3, turning them into giant paperweights. When the shooting stopped, a man in the center bellowed, "Return fire!" and leapt up from behind cover. His men followed suit, shooting with intensity and seemingly blinded by rage. Tyrell popped out from around his tree, his weapon raised. He stayed on the grass to keep out of sight and keep his noise down. Finally, he was nearly on them, breaking across the street when he started shooting. His first 3-round burst hit the merc on the far right of the barricade in the back of the head, blowing his face clean off with the exit wound. His partner right beside him barely had time to react at the sight of blood splattering all over the window, turning his head near halfway before Tyrell painted the vehicle with his brains. The next mercenary up the line saw what was happening, turning and managing to get a shot off and forcing Tyrell to fire wildly while ducking for cover. His bullets hit the man in the chest, impacting his protective vest and sending him to the ground. Tyrell reached the front bumper of the SUV, a good 10 yards from the next shooter. He quickly popped up from behind cover, firing through the windshield towards the last man standing. The bullets tore through the glass of the lead vehicle and into the second one, piercing through the side windows. The bullet missed, but shards of glass jabbed the man in the face. "Contact!" he screamed as he stepped backwards, nearly blinded by blood and glass. "Contact!" Tyrell ducked down behind cover as 3 mercenaries trained their fire on him. The front of the SUV ripped to shreds, turning the front windshield into a spiderweb mess. He laid completely down on the ground, readying his handgun. He kicked forward ever so slightly, so that only his head and gun cleared the front tire. He opened fire at ankle height, hitting one man in the shin and dropping him to the ground. He quickly rolled back into cover as the mercenaries returned fire, down at the ground where he'd been. "Keep your attention on me," Tyrell thought as he readied himself for another strike. With only 5 men remaining, though one with glass bits sticking out of his face and all of them focused on the Delta soldier, No Name made his move. Kemp and the others gave covering fire, pinning anyone who was paying attention to him, and he tore straight for the middle vehicle, lining himself up with the rear axle of the SUV. When No Name reached the vehicle, he aimed his weapon at the window. When the supporting fire died down, Michaels popped up, and his eyes immediately widened at the sight of No Name's weapon bearing down on him. Before he could react further, the bridge of his nose imploded from a bullet. "Let's get out of here!" somebody cried, and the 3 mercenaries left that could run turned to do so. A man on the ground who appeared to have been shot in the shins continued to shoot at Tyrell, who was still behind the front of the convoy, but the bullets just hit the SUV. No Name leapt up onto the hood of the middle vehicle and put a bullet in the fallen mercenary's skull from above. He turned to fire towards the others, but they vanished into the tree line about 30 yards up, on the same side of the road.
"Delta, you good?"
No Name asked, without taking his eyes or aim off of the trees. Tyrell got to his feet. "Yeah, you?" he asked, shaking himself off.
"I'll manage,"
No Name said. And when he was satisfied there was no backup yet, he jumped down from the car.
"But we gotta move. Those boys aren't going to stay in regroup mode for long."
Tyrell nodded. "Get your people, and let's go," he commanded. No Name let out a sharp whistle and everyone came running out from the trees, stopping just short of Tyrell as Kemp raised his rifle, providing a lookout. "Little more than half a mile," Tyrell instructed, pointing back towards the plantation house. "Front door is open, and got 2 covering us. Get moving." He led the charge, and everyone fell in line.
"You got coverage?"
No Name asked as he began to move. "Get going, Commander. They ain't getting by me," Kemp promised, bringing up the rear. He jogged as opposed to running, making sure to keep an eye on the woods where the 3 mercs had run to. No Name kept up with the group, trusting his partner. He had no doubt that at least one of the mercenaries had stayed behind to look at what direction they were going in. They didn't have much time. About 100 yards away, the roar of engines rose behind them, and 3 vehicles screamed down the road, skidding and looping around and driving onto the grass in hot pursuit. "Shit!" Kemp yelled. "Commander!" No Name glanced over his shoulder, spotting his partner about 30 yards behind, and the convoy behind him and closing in fast. They could see the house in the distance finally, just a few 100 yards away, but there was no way they'd make it there before the vehicles were on them. No Name skidded down behind a small hill, and Kemp quickly caught up to him, the duo getting ready to fire.
"Hit 'em hard and hope it makes them stop," the bold mercenary instructed. "At least long enough for us to get to the house."
Kemp nodded, readying his rifle. "You got it, Commander," he replied firmly. When the SUVs were within 100 yards, both of them popped up and opened fire, sending multiple 3-round bursts downrange. They hit the fronts of the vehicles, including one windshield. All 3 stopped for a moment while the barrage of bullets peppered their bumpers. "Go!" No Name cried, and the 2 of them broke from cover, having successfully brought everyone else enough time to get into the house. They ran hard, finally making it within 100 yards of the front door. Engines roared behind them as the vehicles picked up the pursuit again. But before No Name could look over his shoulder, gunshots came out of nowhere. He looked up, seeing a gunman in the upstairs window firing rapidly at the vehicles. The attack forced the 3 SUVs to scatter, going in multiple directions, but staying wide of the house. One went to the front, one to the side, and one managed to tear around to the back. The diversion gave No Name and Kemp enough time to get to a firing line of cars, hopping over it and jumping down next to Terrell.
"Looks like they split up," he said. "Is the house covered?"
No Name asked. The captain nodded. "Yeah, but it looks like we're going to need help out here," he said, pointing to the 2 visible vehicles that stopped about 40 yards shy of them. A fresh set of mercenaries leapt out and took cover, waiting to attack. Kemp and No Name turned and readied their weapons, keeping the enemy in their sights. The gunshots from upstairs stopped, putting things into a tense standoff. Conserving ammunition was a priority, considering they hadn't had much to begin with, and also because they didn't know how many more reinforcements were coming. At the back of the house, in the kitchen, Dante stood next to the back door. It was a large, old, open space with an island just a couple of yards away from the stove. He startled as a man he'd never seen before walked down the hallway, putting him on the defensive. The man raised his hands, holding out his palms. "I'm a friend," he said quickly. "Name's Kenny." Dante lowered his weapon. "Dante," he replied. "Were you with Grace?" "Yeah, she's safe," Kenny replied, and the words were like a balm to the scarred man's heart. "Got her in the middle room with a couple others." Dante's first instinct was to rush to her, wrap her in a tight hug, and never let go. But he knew that he had a job to do. "I saw a vehicle come tearing around the back just now," he said. "Gotta assume they're not friendly." Kenny pulled an assault rifle from his back and cocked it clumsily. "Fair warning," he said. "I'm not very good with this." "Good news is, they don't know that," Dante replied with a small smile. Before they could keep talking, bullets tore into the back of the house, and both men dove for the floor. Shouts rose from the front of the house, and Dante could only assume the attack was happening on that side too. As the bullets in the kitchen stopped, there was a loud crack as someone kicked the door open. A mercenary rushed in, gun raised. Kenny aimed in his general direction from the floor and pulled the trigger, sending a 3-round spray up his way. One lucky bullet punched through the mercenary's upper leg, and he fell to the ground, clutching the wound. He was barely on his knee before another mercenary entered, gun aimed at Kenny, who scrambled back into the hallway that led to the kitchen in hopes of cutting off the angle from the door. The mercenary fired a couple of times, narrowly missing the football player and obliterating the doorframe. Dante leapt up towards the man from the side, grabbing his rifle and aiming it downwards. He fired a few times, trying to hit Dante in the foot, but blasted linoleum instead. Dante struck the man hard in the throat and his gun clattered to the ground. As the mercenary staggered back, another one came in behind him, shoving him forward to get his gagging and gasping comrade out of the way. The new one shoved a handgun over his friend's shoulder, but Dante smacked his wrist just enough to send the trajectory of the shot up, the bullet whizzing by his temple. "Kenny!" Dante bellowed, and the football player popped around the doorframe, aiming towards the back door. He opened fire in 3-round bursts as Dante leapt out of the way, and bullets smacked into the lead merc's vest, sending him stumbling back into the other one. Kenny continued to fire, peppering the man with bullets, most hitting his vest, but a few getting him in the arms. The man in the back stumbled out the door, and as Kenny's shooting stopped, Dante swooped in and kicked the front one in the chest to send them both tumbling back out the door. Both men retreated before Dante could fire after them, so he slammed the door and turned to the wounded man on the ground. Despite the giant, rapidly growing pool of blood that was likely an opened artery, the mercenary shakily pulled out his handgun, attempting to aim it up at Dante. Dante grabbed the gun out of his hand and fired, ending his life with a bullet to the head. He turned towards the door, unable to shut it with the latching mechanism having been kicked in, so he rolled the dead mercenary in front of it to hold it shut. "You good, man?" Kenny asked as he walked up behind him. "Yeah," Dante grunted as he finished the job. Kenny took a deep breath. "Do you think they're coming back?" he asked. Dante raised his eyebrow as he motioned to the bleeding man. "Would you?" he asked. Kenny chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I don't suppose I would," he said. A strangled sob echoed in the kitchen, and Dante turned to see Grace standing in the hallway door. Before either of them could speak, they both rushed together, embracing tightly. She buried her face in his chest, shoulders shaking as she soaked his shirt with tears. "I knew you'd come," she mumbled into his clothes, gripping his shoulders like her life depended on it. Dante couldn't believe she was here, that he was holding his sister, After so much time apart, after so much time worrying whether she was alive or dead, she finally backed up and he held her shoulders, staring down at her tear-streaked face. He reached in with his thumbs and wiped at her cheeks, a smile overtaking his face at the sight of her. "Not meaning to break up the moment," Kenny said reluctantly from the window, "but y'all want to give me a hand watching for these bastards?" Dante nodded, taking a deep breath. "We'll catch up after we're out of this mess," he promised. Grace nodded, her gaze stealing. "I'll go get Nico, Hawk, and Eddie on lookout," she said firmly, and turned on her heel. Dante shook his head for a moment, amazed at how quickly she'd been able to shut down her emotions and hop into battle mode. It was heartbreaking to think of what she'd been through during her time with QXR that had forced her to be this way. But, at least, if she was hardened, she had a better chance of surviving this ordeal. "They managed to get 5 of you off of that island," Dante murmured as he joined Kenny at the window. "They're better than I thought." "We started the day with 8, Kenny said, his tone clipped. Dante grimaced, his chest clenching. He hadn't meant to offend or bring up friends they'd lost that day. "It's all good, man," Kenny shook his head, his tone softening. "This is a shit situation all around." Dante nodded, appreciating him being understanding at his foot-and-mouth moment. Before he could respond in kind, the sharp sounds of helicopter blades swiped the air outside. "That can't be good," Dante muttered. Terrell, Kemp, and No Name watched as a helicopter emerged on the horizon, flying in and landing about 100 yards away in the field. It was a massive transport chopper with a 50 cal machine gun mounted on the side. Within seconds, 6 men got out and walked towards the line, one with a particular swagger that made No Name's blood boil. "Mosley," he growled. Terrell raised an eyebrow. "Friend of yours?" he asked. "More along the lines of arch-nemesis," Kemp quipped. "Well, if I'm the one who ends up killing him, I'll be sure to let you have the credit," Terrell joked. "Owe you one, after all." No Name smirked, nodding as he watched Mosley walk up to the SUV. He held up a walkie-talkie and wiggled it in the air. "Channel 12!" he yelled, the sound of his voice making the bold mercenary's skin crawl. No Name reluctantly pulled out his radio, turning it to the proper channel and raising it to his lips. "Mosley," he said flatly. "There's my big, bold traitor," came the mocking drawl. "How are you and your little butt-buddy doing today?" "Oh, you know, just out for a leisurely morning hike," No Name replied casually. "I would ask how you and your friend are doing, but I'm pretty sure he's busy letting his brains ooze out onto the pavement." "Yeah, I heard about what you did to Michaels," Mosley said darkly. "And all those other good men on the island. It's one thing to go traitor, but how can you sleep at night knowing you killed your comrades in arms?" No Name jutted out his chin. "Whenever I get a chance to get some shut-eye, I'll let you know," he said. "So, what's your big plan, huh?" Mosley asked. "You just gonna keep hiking west? Do you really think there is a place where I won't find you?" No Name sneered, his eyes alight. "Given what I have planned for you, I doubt you'll be able to walk, let alone pursue me," he said. "Surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned," Mosley replied with a chuckle, seemingly unperturbed by the threat. "Yet, you're still a cocky sumbitch. Frankly, it's going to be fun smacking that smoke off your face." "Well, you know where I am," No Name declared. "Whenever you find your balls, you know where to find me." Mosley laughed maniacally through the radio, putting the trio of military vets at a bit of unease. Finally, the laughter stopped, and their enemy's voice grew deadly serious. "I hope you've made peace with whatever god you believe in," he said menacingly, "because it's time to die." The end. Up next, the fallout from the rescue operation continues in the thrilling conclusion of the Lowcountry series.